Hello, friends. You can think of what I share as a kind of teaching of applied enlightenment. That is, I'm not interested in the philosophical discussion of what it is to be enlightened or not enlightened. I'm interested in what it means in daily life. So, for example, if you really want to know love deeply, then you have to become a disciple practically of everything and anything you do inside yourself that closes your heart to love. And one of the things we do is the kinds of imaginary conversations that we have inside of ourselves. Some years ago, I did a recording like the one I'm doing now that was entitled Imaginary Conversations, and it's the most watched of my short teaching videos. So today I'm revisiting that focus. So what do I mean by imaginary conversations? Well, everybody understands at some level that when you're thinking inside yourself, you're kind of like a playwright or a screenwriter. You're writing your own movie. You don't necessarily realize it. And in your movie, you have a part, you're a character, and maybe your husband, your wife, your son or daughter that you're concerned about, a friend that the relationship is struggling. And we rehearse or practice conversations inside our heads about these people. But the problem is that we don't realize that we are the screenwriter and that those people aren't actually real. They're constructions in our own minds. And so the conversation you have in which you're trying to explain something to someone, you're trying to justify yourself, you're looking at their behavior and telling them in your conversation why it doesn't work or why it could be differently, should be differently generally. This is your own theater. It's like this is the stage and you've pulled in the actors and you're forming yourself by the very story you tell yourself. So, for example, if you're worried about your son and who's having trouble maybe with drugs or doesn't seem to want to participate in school very much, and you have one conversation after another, after many failed real conversations or complicated, conflicted, argumentative, even fights in real life between you and your son, maybe between you and a spouse, because it is your child and because you both have different ways of seeing the problems. But inside your head, then you're reliving what your wife or your husband should have been saying to the child, to the son, to the daughter, and how the daughter is this and this and this and isn't behaving the way they should, and their lives won't work well. You see, and until you stop and recognize, now, wait a minute, this is a drama, I'm creating it. What's the dramatic energy here? And you realize you're angry or you're self-righteous or you're building up a head of steam, and now you're grabbing even more thoughts from someplace, and this justifies this, and I remember when he did that, or she did this, or they could have done that. And the theater just gets more and more revved up and complex and imprisoning, because it's all happening there. It's all happening there. And it's prejudicing your internal state. It's activating, it's arousing anger, it's arousing disappointment, it's arousing self-importance. It's poisoning you. Even though you're thinking that this is going to help you get to an understanding and a solution, there's a context for that we can talk about in a minute, the kinds of inner conversations that are appropriate. But I'm not talking about how an athlete, for example, has an inner conversation with the ski slope, visualizes it, or a race car driver walks the track, visualizes it thinks about it. I'm talking about these kinds of endless, dramatic storytellings that people do all the time that create an emotional atmosphere. And the problem is the emotional atmosphere you create and the way you cast the character of your son, of your spouse, of your friend, of the employer, of the coworker. That's never them. They're never actually real. They are psychological constructs. And they're almost like they're hollow shapes. And you could get any person to come in as an actor and play that role on the stage or in the film. So you're creating the role your son is playing and then believing your son is playing that role, or their spouse or your husband. And what you have to do, or what you can do, is say, now, if this is the internal process, when the real conversation happens with the spouse about the child, with the coworker, with the employee or employer, it's already been so prejudiced, so rehearsed, so formed by the internal mental, imaginary conversation, imaginary drama, that there's actually no genuine way to have a conversation in the present moment where you discover the living energy of what's possible in that moment with that individual, where the bonding patterns of, you're the dominating father and he should be the more submissive son, or she's the wonderful daughter, but she's in conflict with her mother and you're her daddy, and none of this is real. People in your minds are not the real people. They're approximations, but it's all being kind of colored by your way of imagining them. And what is necessary from a psychological point of view to free you from a kind of internal agitation, suffering, churning, and give you a chance to see the people in real life are not players in your theater, but actual othernesses, universes unto themselves, who do their own internal imaginary conversations in which they cast you as someone you're not, which you probably usually recognize. When someone's talking to you and it doesn't feel like they're really talking to you or really see you or recognize you, it's probably because they have already concocted their own theater and you're a player in their theater. And the only way that stops is when you stop first your own theater. Don't squeeze yourself into your imaginary son. Don't squeeze your consciousness, conform it to your imaginary spouse, to your imaginary self. Realize what these conversations are creating, that they're blinding you to the actual living moment when you engage another human being, when the possibility of understanding your son or your daughter, the possibility of meeting in a new ground can only happen in that present moment. But your story is in between. So you have to take that internal thought story, that internal drama, and consciously say to yourself, I'm going to stop doing this. As soon as I'm activating a story about my husband, I'm going to stop it. As soon as I'm justifying myself, I'm activating a story about myself in which I'm doing the things I should be doing and taking care and standing up for my, just stop it. Stop it. You wouldn't be standing up for who you really are. You would be standing up for your own psychological construct. Who you really are is there when you stop that kind of imaginary conversation, that imaginary story. Now that's when the heart can speak. That's when a kind of knowing in you that draws on a far more superior intelligence than the ego, your ego's understanding of reality. Your ego is like a little bubble sitting on top of a great reality. And most of what it's sitting on top of these patterns from the past, and it's just obedient to them. And the way it's obedient to them that you can view is in the nature of the stories you're making up, the imaginary conversations you're having in your head again and again and again, which means you're never present to yourself. You're not present to this moment. You're not present to the breeze. You're not present to the light. You're not present to the environment. And your whole, you know, your whole internal reality are just movie after movie after movie, stage play after stage play after stage play. So if you see this, if you hear what I'm saying, if you can visualize what I'm saying, if you can grab hold of some of the conversations that I'm imagining for you, as with a spouse, as with an employer, as with an employee, as with one of your children, as with your mother or your father, put it down, let it go. Don't build yourself this way. Breathe, stay present, listen, discover. When you go do that, you come into a deeper ground in yourself. And as I was getting to a moment ago, that ground is of far superior intelligence than whatever has been conditioned in your sense of me, the ego I. And it's an energy. It's a feeling, it's a felt sense, it's an embodiment, it's a presence. And in that, people become actually real. And you are a quality of attention as opposed to a formed structure filling your imaginary conversations, your imaginary dramas, your imaginary stories with actors that aren't who those people are. And you aren't who you are. So just put it down. Every time you're walking and that starts inside of you, put it down. Anytime you're driving in the car, that kind of stuff starts inside of you, just recognize it, put it down. The what is of the moment has intelligence. The what is of the moment with other people, when everyone has the intelligence to put down these beliefs about each other, these theater pieces about each other, then we get to meet in something that's living, something that's real. We're not always going to agree about things, but our hearts can speak. And when our hearts speak, that other person will hear you. When their hearts speak, you will hear them. You can't hear each other through the imaginary conversations, through the internal theater pieces and dramas. And I know that's who most of us think we are, until you do the experiment of just stopping it again and again and again. You basically are saying to yourself, I don't know who I really am, but I know who I'm not. I'm not these churning stories. I'm not these intricate mental dramas. I'm not these internal wars and battles for psychological balance, which is actually psychological imbalance. It's your ego's sense of strength, or being who you should be, or how it, and taking care of things the way they should be. Let go of the imaginary conversations. Let go of the imaginary drama. Let go of the imaginary theater, and find out what your heart will say, how your heart will hear, how your heart will see, how your field, your energetic presence will vibrate, will resonate with other people in a real way. I'm not saying you feel good. I'm not saying everything gets harmonized. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's real. It's lived more at the level of immediate sensation, body knowing, as opposed to mental theater, mental theater, mental theater. And then you'll discover you don't need a mental theater to relate to people. You don't need a mental theater to have intimacy with a spouse. In fact, the mental theater blocks the intimacy. The mental theater has created from the very beginning of, for example, your mental theater about your own baby, about your own child as he or she grew up, as teachers gave feedback, as the child played in a certain way, as they found certain friends, again and again and again. If it didn't fit your theater, or you put it into a theater that got you upset, you created a relationship with your own child that had very little reality in it, that was based in fear. Maybe you wanted to protect them, but you weren't finding out who they were. Now, of course, when children are very young, you must set limits all the time. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about see the fantasy, the story you tell yourself about the setting limits, and set the limits while you're presencing deeply with that child. Don't disconnect your energy field because you're in a theater about what it means to be a mother or a father, worrying about that child doing that specific thing, or wanting that child to do something you think would be good for him or good for her. Stop that. Set the limits that protects them from self-harm. Set the limits that foster in their greatest capacity for well-being. And they're not going to necessarily agree with you, but never cut off the energetic connection. The internal imaginary conversations have no energetic connection. It's a pure mind-made virtual reality. Slow down. Find out who you are. Find out what your relationships are. As you consciously and purposely stop that kind of mental activity. Try it. Try it. You'll discover your days are more peaceful. You have more energy. You're flowing more readily. You're less likely to be triggered by someone. And when you are triggered, then you're going to start your theater. Okay? So, is your theater going to be, they triggered me, they're responsible, and he should know this or she should know that, or I have to stand up for myself in this way or that way? Or is your theater going to be, wait a minute, I wrote this play, I'm writing it right now, I'm casting the characters, I'm giving them the roles, I'm telling them what to say, including me, myself, telling myself what to say in these imaginary theater pieces. And you just go, stop. I'm going to do an experiment. And this is what I meant at the beginning of applied enlightenment. Who you are when you set these down is closer to your essential nature. It's closer to reality. It's a different energetic. It's not activated by the same emotional intensity. You don't exist because you feel the emotional activation that you're doing with your stories, your imaginary conversations all the time. You discover, there's something more here. There's something more that I am, more that this is. Try it. Practice this again and again and again and again. And you'll start to rest in a quietness, in a spaciousness that's insightful. You'll start to have the capacity to touch and be touched by others. There'll be a way to bridge differences without creating discord and division. If we want to find out what life on earth can be with other human beings, just do an experiment. Find out who you are, they are, what is, the what is of the relationship, the what is of the family, the what is of the work environment. When your stories and your dramas are consciously set aside, Who are you right now in any context if it's not mediated by a theater piece that you yourself have written or your parents wrote for you, and so on and so on? Some of these theater pieces are really, really old. And frankly, I know they're uninteresting because when you put them down, this right now, this is really substantial. This is more than interesting. Blessings. Think about this.